So Doctor Sleep is the sequel to The Shining. Now this is another film, another belated sequel that actually is contributing very nicely to this collection of films that are sequels that come out 30 or 40 years later and actually have something new to say with them. Bring something new to the table. I mean, we've seen it with stuff like, Mad Max Fury Road, Blade Runner 2049, and last year with Halloween. And here we kind of have the same situation again, where we return to The Shining, and it's not just a retread, like it's actually carrying on with the characters and introducing new characters and finding new stuff to do with The Shining. This is based on the 2013 novel by Stephen King, which is, the continuation of it. Now, it's interesting because this story actually explores more of The Shining and what are, like, the capabilities of these powers. Now, initially, when I heard that premise, I started getting, a little bit, a little terrified, and not in the way the film intended. I thought, okay, they're going to spend way too much time trying to explain this stuff, and I think it's going to dwarf anything else that happens in the film. But I was surprised. I mean, this is a film that it embraces the same a similar atmosphere to that of The Shining by never over explaining the kind of the supernatural and paranormal elements of this type of story, all about fear and death. In fact, there's a lot of great themes in this film too. So Ewan McGregor plays Danny, the grown-up version of Danny. I remember Doc from The Shining who had the Shining. Well, he's grown up, and he's kind of tried to come to terms with this power of his. So in other words, he's tried to forget the past. He's tried to shut it out. He's developed a means within his mind to literally just lock all these ghosts that keep haunting him up in boxes and kind of bottle up this power that he has, because he doesn't want to use his power, and it seems like the only way to stop using it is to just dull it, by just drowning himself in booze. But he clearly has a problem. He's still haunted by the past. He still doesn't feel good about himself. So he's got to come to terms with himself. So he ends up going to a small town to try to reinvent himself, to get off the booze, to start over, to start a new life. At the same time, we have a troupe of what seem to be the kind of like immortals that kind of feed off The Shining. So in other words, there's a lot of these people who apparently, if you find people with the shine, you can ingest them and start living longer. And they're led by Rose the Hat, played by Rebecca Ferguson. And it's interesting. I love this aspect of trying to develop her as a villain, because she's playing off of a lot of the fears, that come with death here. Like, the biggest theme of this film by far is, coming to terms not just with yourself, but of like aging and death. So you have Ewan McGregor here, who he kind of learns to come to terms with death on his own terms. Like, he works in a hospice, and so he gets to spend a lot of time around people who are dying and get to better understand what it means to pass over and to feel. Thank you for the follow and the host there as well. So he understands what it's like to. Thank you so much there. I got thrown off my train of thought there. So it's... Where was I? Oh, yeah. So it's interesting. I like that... Where was it? Sorry, I lost it there. Thank you so much for the follow, the host, though. That's very, very helpful. Thank you so much, like that. So... Where was I? Oh, yeah. So Danny, since he works in a hospice, he learns to come to terms with death and sort of, realize that it's not such a bad thing, but also that he has to learn, he still has to learn, the acceptance of himself. While Rose the Hat and her band of other people who are ingesting The Shining can't see themselves, dying. They're terrified of death. And so it's interesting because these villains they're horrifying. They're terrible. There's a really shocking sequence of just straight up like torture and murder that is probably one of the most frightening things I've seen on screen this year. But I like how it's also like they're acting out of fear. Because they fear that, you know, their time has come. And there's also, yeah, there's a bit of like a cannibalistic edge to it as well, of like, shining people eating other shining people. But what gets Danny to actually get out of his funk and actually, combat Rose the Hat is this little girl called Abra, who's played by Kylie Curran. I think I'm saying it correctly. And she is I think, kind of like a teenage, preteen girl who is just sort of like learning to come to terms with her powers. And she figures out, she can use them to communicate with people. And so she kind of becomes pen pals with Doc. So they learn to connect and they learn more about their powers. And we kind of open up more on, what it means to have the Shining. But here's the thing. I like that the film never outright explains it. A lot of people are going to be saying, well, I don't know how you could do this with The Shining, or how did that happen? But I like the fact that they never slow down to explain it too much, so that the bigger theme of what The Shining represents is always present on screen. And it never gets lost, too. I really admire that about this picture. Because clearly, as the film goes on, you see there's a very clear allegory here about, not being afraid to be yourself and to show off your powers, and to be weary of people who prey on your powers and want to draw you into their fold. Like the whole deal with Rose the Hat is that they have to decide whether or not they want to ingest the Shining out of people, so which basically means killing them and eating their souls, or do they take them into their pack as like, the more powerful Shining people that they can use to get more Shining. So it's a vicious cycle. And I kind of like the desperation of the villain here, because I mean, in terms of like shocking powers of what they can do, the villains here are not that intimidating. I mean, they're horrifying and everything, but they get their asses kicked pretty hard here once both Abra and Danny come to terms with themselves and what they should do with the Shining. So it's a very interesting film. I mean, yes, like the one thing that I think kind of holds the film back is that, yeah, it does delve a little bit more into the familiar aspects of The Shining. We get a few flashbacks, we see some footage from the original movie, and of course, the climax brings us right back to the Shining mansion. I kind of wish that they didn't. I kind of understand why they did, but at the same time, it's not like it's entirely forced. I mean, it does play in with the theme that Danny needs to come to terms with his past and try to deal with it, and also deal with the acceptance of death in the way that Rose can't deal with it either. Both their performances here are amazing here. The special effects are used just perfectly to like the right amount, and there are some very special effects heavy sequences in here. Like at one point we were learning that the people with the Shining, if they have enough power, they can apparently transport themselves or project themselves, but again, not overly explained here, just for like, the cool sight here and to keep the story moving without explaining too much. The one thing I gotta mention though is that you will notice in these flashbacks they don't show Jack Nicholson's character. They don't show him. And they do this for good reason. Like, because initially I thought, okay, they're not going to show, Jack from the previous film. They're not going to show Jack Torrance because they don't want you to think of him, because they're going to bring him back in this film. Like, this film brings back a lot of familiar characters played by new actors, and they actually commit to it, which does really great. I mean, they have a new actor playing Shelley Duvall's character. They have a new actor playing Scatman Crothers' character. They do a really good job too. I gotta admit, I love that these actors are trying to I love the fact that this film itself is not just trying to recreate the actors with CGI, and is actually trying to bring in actors to reenact these characters in such a way that I think really works. But I was terrified because there's a moment where Danny goes into the Shining mansion and he's at the bar. And we can hear, and we're referred to, the bartender is pretty much Jack. And I got chills. I thought, oh man, I know they're gonna show the bar. I'm fairly certain they're gonna show a CGI Jack Nicholson, and I got terrified. But then they pull back and they show it, and it's it's Henry Thomas, not Jack Nicholson, and he's actually playing a rather subtle performance as Jack. And I gotta admit, I was amazed. Like that one sequence, I was getting like antsy, like, ooh. I mean, the sequence itself is terrifying, but I was terrified that we're gonna get CGI Jack Nicholson. But then we didn't, and we actually got actors doing really great performances here. There is, I gotta admit, this film is pretty clever. It's well edited too. I mean, there's really a moment where they waste too much time here, especially for a film where Danny slowly comes to terms with himself. It feels like we're going along with it and never meandering too far off course here, which again I think helps without having that exposition of The Shining. I think that we keep the story going, which is great. I also love the way this film is directed. There's a lot of amazing shots and great uses of scares here. There's a little bit of violence here and there, and once it shows up, I love the fact that the violence is so sparing that when it shows up, it's pretty damn gruesome and horrifying. That it's very effective. I mean, it's a little tough to decide, if it's on par with The Shining. I mean, The Shining has so many layers to it, and I feel like Doctor Sleep is a little bit more straightforward. But I think that, and especially with like the themes that are going for here, about the desperation of people who seek power and the corruption of it, and coming to terms with death and coming to terms with yourself and not being afraid to be yourself, are far more apparent here. But that's kind of what I like about the film. I like that it finds its own groove rather than just directly trying to replicate the elements of The Shining, even though on the surface, it does kind of bring in a lot of familiar elements. It brings in the mansion. It brings some more of the ghosts and characters and some of the music cues, obviously. But it makes great use of them. There are several moments where it's terrifying. There are several moments where it's trippy, and just well-directed scenes here. It's such a damn good film from Mike Flanagan. That again, it's another film you can put in that neat little box set that I want to assemble of sequels 30 or 40 years after the fact that turn out to be really great and actually have something worth saying and worth checking out. So for Dr. Sleep, 4 out of 5 stars.